Hi everyone, welcome to Drug School. This is your host Adam. Today we're going to be talking about becoming a pharmacy technician in Alabama. Welcome to Drug School. Welcome back to Drug School. This is Adam, and it is my pleasure to have you join us again today. And today we're going to talk about becoming a pharmacy technician in Alabama. This is actually the third in our series. I had meant to do Alabama before I did Alaska, so my apologies for not going in alphabetical order like I had promised to do this series. So the first of this series deals with the 5 unregulated states as well as the Virgin Islands, which is the one territory that does not require a license. So we dealt with them first because that is the easiest of the 5 to knock out of the way. When we get to other states, though, we're going to talk about some wild and crazy technician scopes of practice. However, in the state of Alabama, it's a lot more limited, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But I want to go back to this map, and this map tells you a lot. I get this map from the Pharmacy Technician Certification Board. If you go to ptcb.org, they have this in their Pharmacy Technician Toolbox on their webpage, so it is a publicly available graphic. They do allow you to share it for educational purposes. So I do not intend any copyright infringement on this since I am using it for an educational purpose. But this is PTCB's 2016 State of Pharmacy Technician licenses, and this is the most current information that they have. You will notice that there are 5 states that are unregulated. We discussed those first, although I may actually have to update this series later on because rumor has it Pennsylvania is going to start getting a pharmacy technician regulation regarding licensure in the very near future. That currently is not the case. But what I want to talk about is what these hash marks mean, as well as the solidly tan states. The hash marks on this map mean that pharmacy technician certification is mentioned somewhere in their pharmacy technician licensing regulations. So somewhere along the lines in the states that are hashed out tan and white, you either have to be certified in order to get a license, or certification is somewhere mentioned in the regulations. When we get to Michigan and Washington, specifically those 2 states, I'm going to point out more notably, they have some very strange relationships as far as technician certification goes. And Alabama has one of those strange rules too. Alabama is solidly tan, and what tan means is that when you go to get a license in the state of Alabama with the Board of Pharmacy, you are not required to actually go get a license. That is not mandatory to have certification in order to get a license. But they have a very strange regulation about pharmacy technician ratios, and we'll get into that in a moment. But as far as getting a license itself, all you have to do is be 17 years old, and you probably have to consent to some kind of criminal background check. They want to make sure that you're not going to steal drugs from your employer. If you change jobs, let's say you work for the 3-letter chain, that was my past history almost 11 years ago, and I go to work for an independent. You have to notify ALBOP, not to be confused with UMBOP, which is the Hanson song. ALBOP is the Alabama Board of Pharmacy. You must notify them if you change jobs within 10 days. Pharmacists have the same requirement, so it's not just a difference between pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. For every pharmacist, you can only have 3 technicians supervising them. Or, I'm sorry, although it does feel like some days you're watching over your pharmacist more than your pharmacist watches over you. Um, Ask some of my past pharmacists, they'll tell you that. The technicians look out for the pharmacists more than the pharmacists look out for the technicians. Um, I've had a few pharmacists in my life where they've gone, thank you for saving my bacon. Um, so for every pharmacist in the building, they're allowed 3 technicians. Of those 3 technicians, one of them must be certified. And while that makes, legally speaking, while that makes certification an optional thing to become employed, a lot of pharmacies are cutting back on their staffing levels lately. And it's not terribly uncommon where it's just going to be a pharmacist and a pharmacy technician. So in the state of Alabama, the way I read their code, that means if a pharmacist is in a building and they only have 1 technician, that technician had darn well better be certified. I don't know how they enforce that. I'm not a lawyer, nor have I actually undergone an Alabama Board of Pharmacy inspection to verify how they read that code. But off the cuff, the way the regulation reads, if you have 1 pharmacist on staff, they're allowed 3 technicians, 1 of the 3 must be certified. And I take that to be at the time in that building. So keep that in mind. That I'm not a lawyer, but the way I read the regulation as it's posted on the Alabama Board of Pharmacy website, this is based on the shift. It's not necessarily what the employment status is of the pharmacist. It's not like for each pharmacist you have in the building, you're only allowed 3 technicians at all. It means on that particular day, if a Board of Pharmacy inspector walked in, you had 1 pharmacist and 4 technicians working, you would technically be in violation of that law. Likewise, if you only had a pharmacist and a technician and that technician was uncertified, you would also be in violation of that law. So I take that to be on that particular given day. If you have a pharmacist in the building, you're allowed up to 3 technicians, and 1 of those 3 technicians must be certified. Pharmacy technicians are allowed to check in non-controlled inventory. They can type a prescription, they can count a prescription, they can place and label prescriptions in appropriate containers. That quite literally is taken off of the Alabama Board of Pharmacy website, and it is a little oddly specific as to what you're allowed to do. One of the things they do not address is whether or not pharmacy technicians are allowed to do compounding. They don't address that at all. You cannot do anything that requires the professional judgment of a pharmacist, and that includes but is not limited to communicating with an office to verify or accept a prescription. So if a prescription has any ambiguity to it, it goes to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist is the one making the phone call. This varies from one state to another. So some states are allowed to do this, some states are not. And this just goes to the patchwork of laws that we have as we go throughout the country. And you're going to find that some states give a very broad stroke of practice to their pharmacy technicians, and there are some states where technician practices are a lot more clamped down. If you were to ask me what drives that, and I think some of that is just how pharmacy technicians were employed before licensing laws kicked in, and what their experiences are with their technicians. So if you're in a state where education really doesn't have a great footing, you're likely to see a lot more conservative regulations surrounding the technician's scope of practice. So if you think about how the only requirement is to be able to pass a criminal background check and be 17 years old to work in a pharmacy, in the state of Alabama, they're probably going to restrict your scope of practice a lot more. When we looked at Alaska, that was the case. Now, the 5 unregulated states, the pharmacist controls what the technicians can and cannot do. So you do see this as we go throughout the states, that the states that are a lot more comfortable with their technicians are going to paint their scopes of practice with a lot broader brush. And we'll start seeing that, especially when we get out to California or Utah or Iowa or Idaho. Idaho is an actually interestingly unique case, but we'll talk about that when we get there. In what they allow their technicians to do. Washington has some very wild educational requirements. That's very unique to their state. So each of these states is going to paint a different brush based on what is required to obtain the license that they give you. So when we go through these states, you'll notice that the states that have more stringent requirements for obtaining a pharmacy technician license are also going to give you the largest scope of practice. And with those larger scopes of practice usually also come larger pay rates as well. So you have to keep in mind that the states that are very locked down as to what they allow technicians to do are going to not offer the same amount of pay that you would typically see in a state where the pharmacy technician is allowed to do a lot more work. Of special note, you cannot prepare a copy, meaning you cannot prepare a transfer to another pharmacy, or read the prescription to another person. And this is another unique thing. A lot of states, I know in Michigan where I practice, it's not terribly uncommon that you would see a technician take a bottle out of a bag and read it to a patient, just to make sure that they understand the directions that are given to them. You can't even read the label to a patient in the state of Alabama. All of that would have to be done by a pharmacist. So they really do have some very clamped down rules in the state of Alabama as far as what they allow technicians to do. You also cannot place controlled drugs into inventory. And this is another unique rule in the state of Alabama. Although it's not unique to the state of Alabama, it's a fairly unique rule in a very handful amount of states where I would imagine what caused this rule to exist is they had a lot of technicians who were taking drugs from the pharmacy. And because of that, they wanted to clamp down on whether or not the technicians had access to those controlled substances. So when we talk about pharmacy regulation and why pharmacy regulations get put into place, and I'll probably do a separate video on why regulation exists in the first place, a lot of times it's a knee-jerk reaction to what is perceived to be a large problem. So pharmacy technicians do not have access to the controlled substances in the state of Alabama. Now, the argument could be that, well, the pharmacists then have all the access and they have all the control. What's to keep the pharmacist from taking the drugs? You have a very valid point there. The overarching goal is pharmacists get paid a heck of a lot more than technicians do, so the need to take the drugs to sell them on the street is a lot lower for pharmacists than it is for technicians. That's kind of where they went from the intent of the law. And like it or leave it, it is what it is. As far as continuing education goes, Alabama is the first state I came across where the only continuing education allowed must be ACPE approved. Most states usually have some exemption from this, but all continuing education in the state of Alabama must be ACPE approved, and it must have the T designation at the end. There's a P designation at the end and a T designation at the end. The T means technician, P means pharmacist, just so you're aware of that. You must obtain 3 hours of CE annually, and no, you can't get 6 for your biennial license renewal and count them over the course of both years. You get 3 this year, you get 3 next year, you renew your license next year. Licenses are annual, meaning they go from January 1st to December 31st. But you renew them every other year. So if your license is renewed at the end of last year, you'll renew it again at the end of 2020, this video being published in 2019. But if you renewed at the end of 2018, you're going to need 3 hours this year. One of those must be live. I'll tell you how to identify that in a minute. Then next year you have to get 3 more. Another one of those must be live, so that's a total of 6. If you're keeping certification, a great strategy to avoid any conflict with this is to get 10 in any one given year. It solves all of your issues. As far as determining whether or not it's live, in an ACPE accredited program, the last 4 characters tell you what type of program it is. In the activity number. The first letter is either going to be an L or an H. L means live, H means home study. The very following 2 digits tell you what type of CE it is. As we go through the states, those numbers matter a little bit more. But in the state of Alabama, any content that is ACPE approved is allowed to be used. Only one of them must be live, so you have to have at least 1 hour each year with an L designation on it. Renewal of licenses every other year, and that occurs on December 31st of the year. You can start applying for it on October 1st, so you get almost essentially an entire 3 months to get your license renewed. Some states allow a lot shorter period of time. Michigan's going to be a really weird case when we get to it later on. And that is it for becoming a technician in the state of Alabama. If you have any questions about this video, please leave them in the comments. I do reply to all comments, and I do appreciate any questions or comments that you may have. If you like the content that you see on Drug School, please subscribe to this channel. Would love to have this community just continue to grow. Again, it was my pleasure to have you join us today. And if you'd like to support Drug School and the recording of more of this content, please consider a donation on patreon.com/drugschool. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to having you join us again sometime in the near future. Thanks for watching.